taught you, please, who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other. No, before you come asking Mr. Muhammad, does he teach hate, you should ask yourself who taught you to hate being what God gave you.
It has often been said that black people are not a monolith. This is pretty obvious if one thinks about it for even a few seconds, seeing as no two people are the same. And even when accounting for cultural similarities, there tends to be significant differences regionally. Black people in Georgia have a different lived experience than those in New York, whose experience differs from those in Texas versus those in California. And that's still speaking nothing of the vastly different experiences of black people across the diaspora internationally. An experience that is pretty universal and unifying amongst black people that live among a majority white population, however, is the deeply inextricable link between navigating our own identities as black individuals and the need to survive navigating a white-dominated space. The term double consciousness was popularized by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois in his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk, Essays and Sketches, and refers to a dual sense of self-perception. More specifically, double consciousness refers to Black American experience of always looking at oneself through the eyes of a racist white society and measuring oneself by the means of a nation that looked back in contempt. This is a concept that I vaguely alluded to in a previous video called Should We Gatekeep Blackness? The very idea of blackness and what that means has become distorted and ultimately filtered through the lens of whiteness and how white people perceive black people. Simply put, white people get to just be themselves. Meanwhile, even by virtue of simply existing, black people have the additional burden of traversing the deep waters of systemic racism and prejudices. This additional burden is in and of itself a large part of what it means to be black, particularly here in the United States, but also anywhere where there is a significant white population. Now obviously, as I mentioned before, black experiences certainly vary, and the way we individually engage with and respond to living under the microscope of external white examination will vary. However, there are certain variables that are more likely to elicit a specific trauma response from an individual. And for the purposes of this video, we're going to be looking at one of the more extreme scenarios and the outcome it typically produces. Growing up black with almost no other black influences around. The Oreo is an entire stereotype that is well known and often ridiculed within the black community. So named because they are black on the outside and white on the inside. Oreos are the most likely outcome when a black child is surrounded by white people for most of their lives and end up either consciously or subconsciously adapting to their culture, mannerisms, habits, and ways of thinking. To be clear, Oreos are not necessarily coons, and coons are not necessarily Oreos, but the Venn diagram has some pretty significant overlap on those demographics. Oreos are often created by accident. A black family may move out of necessity in pursuit of a better life for themselves and their kids, and end up in a situation where they are now surrounded by white people. Which leads me to a quick myth that needs to be dispelled. In most cases, when a black family moves to a white neighborhood, it is not because they inherently believe that this proximity to whiteness is inherently better for their family, but rather ironically, systemic racism all but guarantees that black neighborhoods will be overpoliced and underfunded, making many of them far from ideal places to raise a family. Regardless, a young child finding themselves in this situation would need an extraordinarily strong counterbalance at home to avoid falling into the Oreo trap. And if their parents are always working so they can provide a good life for their children, this is just much less likely to happen. And without this strong counterbalance, a young black child faces two very real choices. assimilate, or stick out like a sore thumb. And with us humans being the social creatures that we are, it's pretty obvious which path most kids in this situation choose. It is almost never a conscious decision, to be clear. A black kid adopting a pseudo-white identity typically is a slow, subconscious, almost Pavlovian-like process, as their white peers and teachers, also many times unknowingly, slowly reward black children for fitting in. Simple passive-aggressive statements such as, "You're not ghetto at all," "See, you're not like the others," to the brain of a socially unaware child will likely be perceived as a compliment instead of the gross racism it clearly is. This misinterpretation only further cements in their brain that they need to act more like X and less like Y, and thus produces an anti-black sentiment within their brain without ever explicitly being told that they need to spurn blackness or black culture. This is why, when an Oreo is finally exposed to black people, they essentially experience culture shock. They are, for all intents and purposes, white without actually being white. And the mindset that they developed from their prolonged exposure to white people would have sufficiently poisoned their minds that black people around them will immediately pick up on it and spurn them accordingly. And this is where an interesting dynamic develops. From the perspective of the Oreo, white people have always been nice to them, and their inability to fit in with black people almost seems to confirm what they were taught, which is that they are different and one of the good ones. The stinging rejection they feel from what should ostensibly be their own community is why many of them eventually just straight up become cool. From the perspective of the black people that the Oreo encounters, they can almost immediately tell that something isn't right about this person. Though blackness is not monolithic by any means, as I've already stated earlier, there is definitely a vibe. And as black people, we know when something isn't quite right with one of our skin folk. More important than whatever superficial differences may exist, however, Oreos will inevitably truly out themselves with the passive-aggressive anti-black sentiments that they learned from their white counterparts. This will typically take the form of respectability politics or bootstrap rhetoric. And because the Oreo will likely be teased for talking white, they usually internalize this in the most literal sense and incorrectly assume that they are being rejected solely because their cadence more closely resembles the peoples of the Caucasus Mountains than that of their own people. They fail to do the heavy lifting of self-reflection and introspection that their latent anti-blackness is not welcome amongst black people, who did not grow up essentially getting hat pats from the white man for being such a good boy. Even when Oreos aren't necessarily overtly anti-black, their attitudes, choices, and preferences still earn them some disgust from the black community. For example, Donald Glover, aka Childish Gambino, is exceptionally talented. Few people of any racial background can deny that, but his seeming preference for white women has definitely seen him be panned by the black community at large. For myself personally, there's a reason I used Marques Brownlee in the thumbnail. For those of you who live under a rock, Marques Brownlee is a tech reviewer on YouTube, a wildly successful one, and at the time of this writing, he has over 18 million subscribers on YouTube alone. I have not quite been watching Marques from the very beginning, but I've watched his videos for many years when he was much younger and still a one-man operation. However, as he grew more successful, as happy as I was to see a talented young black man get the exposure and success he deserved, it always irked me that he seems to insist on filling his team with white people. I'm not saying he should have done the opposite and only hired black people, but it really and truly boggles my mind. Like, you couldn't find one black man or woman that was qualified for a spot on your team? Not one? And this is the ironic mindset of Oreos in general. They will continuously distance themselves from the black community and then blame black people for that distance. It may seem like I'm going in pretty hard on Oreos, and perhaps I am somewhat. My purpose is not to bash Oreos though. On the contrary, I do believe some empathy can and should be extended to our milk salt brothers and sisters. To be clear, I am definitely not talking about cougars. Cougars are too far gone, forever trapped in the sunken place. We can't help them now. Oreos, on the other hand, can typically still be reached before they cross over to the Milky Way for good. It is hardly a coincidence that many Oreos are typically on the darker side. Lighter skinned black people have a built-in proximity to whiteness that shields them somewhat from the worst prejudices and instincts of white people. So they are far less likely to get pulled into the vortex of white respectability. Dark-skinned people, on the other hand, are inherently viewed as a greater threat by white people and are treated as such. For this reason, when they are exposed to white people from a young age, white people seize this opportunity to mold them into one of the good ones. So I implore you, don't give up on your Oreo cousin, coworker, or colleague. It may not be too late for them, and it certainly isn't their fault. And at the end of the day, navigating this racist landscape, we all we got. Now I know every YouTuber, including myself, says this to drive engagement, but I would genuinely love to see some discourse about this in the comments, and I will be participating myself. I would love to know what you guys thought about what I had to say. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think I missed some important points? This was just a topic that was sort of in the back of my head, and I just sort of had to get it out. I just rolled out of bed, wrote up the script, and recorded it all in like 2 hours. So, you know, it was literally just something that's been in the back of my mind that I wanted to get off my chest that I felt needed discussing, but I would love to hear some other perspectives. That being said, thank you so much for getting this far into the video and appreciating my work. I genuinely appreciate it. I appreciate all the love. I've been getting some slow growth lately, and it does not go unnoticed. If you would love to support, patreon.com/progressive writer. And I'm also working on something super special for you guys. Thank you so much and stay tuned. Like, share, subscribe.